The stars burned cold in the observation deck as Lisa Morgan stood watching the vast emptiness of space. Her reflection in the transparent steel showed a woman who looked human enough at first glance, but the slight point to her ears and the way her eyes caught the light betrayed her true heritage. She was one of the last pure-blooded elves in the galaxy, and she carried the weight of her people's history like a cloak she could never remove. Behind her, two dragons lay curled together on the heated floor panels. The larger one was crimson scales that seemed to hold fire within them, and his name was Ember. The smaller one had scales like midnight, sky dotted with stars, and her name was Nova. They were not pets, despite what some species called them. They were family and companions, and the last living links to a magic the galaxy had forgotten. Lisa turned from the window and walked to the communication console. The message waiting there had arrived 3 hours ago, and she had read it 17 times already. Each time the words hit harder. Earth was under attack. The Krellian Empire had sent their war fleet, and human defenses were holding but barely. The message came from her friend, Kate Sullivan, who worked at the Human Defense Coordination Center in New York, and the desperation in her words was clear even through the formal military language. The elves had lived on Earth for nearly 300 human years now. They had arrived in ships that were barely holding together, and with a population that had dwindled to less than 10,000. Every other species in the galaxy had turned them away. The Vathari said elves carried disease. The Centaurians said their ships were too damaged to be worth salvaging. The Krellians had tried to capture them for slave labor. Species after species had seen the elves not as people but as problems or opportunities. Then they found Earth, and humanity was still new to the galactic stage back then. They had only achieved faster than light travel 50 years before, and they were still figuring out their place among the stars. When the elf ships appeared in orbit, the human governments had debated for 3 days. Some wanted to help immediately, others worried about the cost or the political complications. But in the end, humanity did what Lisa had learned was their defining characteristic. They helped because it was right. The humans had given the elves land in the Pacific Northwest and in Scandinavia and in New Zealand. They had shared medical technology and food supplies and asked for nothing in return except friendship. Human children played with elf children in schools built for both. Human scientists worked alongside elf scholars to blend technology and magic. Human families invited elf families to holidays and celebrations. Within a generation, the two peoples were so intertwined that most humans forgot the elves had ever been outsiders. Lisa remembered, though. She had been there on that first day when the human president had spoken to the Elf Council and said that Earth had room for everyone who came in peace. She had been barely an adult by elf standards, but she had understood that humanity had given her people something more precious than land or resources. They had given them hope and dignity and a future. The dragon stirred behind her, sensing her emotional turmoil through the bond they shared. Ember raised his massive head and rumbled deep in his chest. The sound vibrated through the deck plates. Nova stretched her wings, and the membrane between the bones was so thin that light shone through, creating patterns on the floor. The dragons were a gift that humanity did not even know they had given. 200 years ago, a human mining expedition in the asteroid belt had discovered something impossible: dragon eggs preserved in ice that had somehow survived in the frozen void of space for uncounted millennia. The humans could have sold them or studied them or destroyed them. Instead, they had brought them to the elves because human legends spoke of elves and dragons together, and they thought perhaps the elves would know what to do. The elves did know. Their ancient texts spoke of dragons and the magic required to wake them and bond with them. It was magic the elves thought lost forever because it required a level of power their weakened people could no longer generate. But Earth had something their old world never did: ley lines of natural energy that human scientists were only beginning to detect and measure. The planet thrummed with power, and the elves learned to tap into it. They had woken 12 dragons from those eggs. Each bonded with an elf who had the gift and the temperament. Lisa had been one of the chosen, and her bond with Ember and Nova was so deep that she could feel their hearts beating in rhythm with her own. The dragons grew quickly on Earth. Something about the planet's energy fed them and made them stronger than the ancient texts suggested was possible. The human governments knew about the dragons, of course. They had helped build the sanctuary in Montana where the dragons lived and trained. Human engineers had designed the thermal regulation systems. Human biologists had studied dragon nutrition. Human teachers had even helped educate the young elves chosen as dragon riders in tactics and strategy. But what the humans did not know was the true extent of what the elves had been preparing for. The Elf Council had made a decision 3 generations ago. They would never be helpless refugees again. They would never watch their people die while begging others for mercy. They had spent 2 centuries building in secret. The small trading ships that the galaxy saw were real enough, but they were not the only ships. Hidden in the asteroid field beyond Pluto was a fleet of warships constructed using elf magic and human engineering combined. Hidden in bases on Mars and the moons of Jupiter were weapons that could crack planets. Hidden in the bones and blood of 12 dragons was power enough to burn fleets from the sky. All of it had been kept secret from humanity. The elves told themselves it was to protect their friends. If humans knew about the weapons, then other species might accuse Earth of building an empire. If humans knew about the fleet, then there might be pressure to use it for conquest rather than defense. But Lisa knew the truth. The elves had kept secrets because shame ran deep. They were terrified of becoming like the species that had hurt them. They were terrified of letting power corrupt them the way it corrupted everyone else. Now the choice was here and there was no more time for doubt. The Krellians were attacking Earth and Lisa had to decide whether to reveal everything her people had built. She pulled up the tactical display and studied the battle over Earth. 30 Krellian warships against the human defense fleet and hundreds of ground batteries. The humans were fighting hard, but Krellian technology was older and more refined. The human ships were being picked apart one by one. Lisa made her decision and sent out the call. Every elf bonded to a dragon felt it simultaneously through the magical network that connected them. Every elf working in the secret bases received their orders. Every elf captain commanding hidden warships began powering up weapons that had never been fired in anger. The machinery of war that had been built over centuries activated all at once. Ember and Nova stood and the temperature in the observation deck rose from their excitement. They could feel what was coming through the bond. Battle and fire and the chance to protect their home. Lisa reached out and placed a hand on each dragon and felt their power flowing into her, and her power flowing into them. The 3 of them together were more than the sum of their parts. They were magic and muscle and mind united. She opened a channel to the Elf Council, and the 12 faces that appeared on the screen were grim but determined. They had all made the same decision she had. The vote was unanimous. The time for hiding was over. The time for secrets was done. Humanity had stood by the elves when they had nothing. Now the elves would stand by humanity with everything. Lisa gave the order, and across the solar system, elf ships began emerging from hiding. They dropped out of stealth near the Krellian fleet, and their weapons came online with a glow that looked like stars being born. On Earth in the Montana Sanctuary, 11 other dragons spread their wings and took flight with their bonded riders. In the council chambers on the moon, the elf ambassador requested an emergency session with all galactic species represented. The war that the Krellians thought would be easy was about to become their worst nightmare. The species they had dismissed as weak traders were about to show teeth that had been hidden for far too long. And the humans who had shown kindness to strangers were about to learn that sometimes kindness came back as salvation. Lisa walked toward the transport bay with her dragons following. She could feel the ship around her coming alive with purpose. Elf crew members moved through corridors heading to battle stations they had trained for, but never expected to use. The ship itself was a masterpiece called the Silver Dawn, and it had been built in the shadow of Saturn over 50 years. It carried weapons that could crack moons and shields that could withstand starfire, and it was just one of 30 identical ships in the hidden fleet. As she strapped into the command harness in the Dragon launch bay, Lisa felt calm settle over her. This was right. This was what her people had prepared for. Not conquest or revenge, but protection of those who had protected them. The bay doors opened to reveal the black of space and the distant blue marble of Earth. Somewhere down there, Kate Sullivan was coordinating defenses and wondering if help would come. Somewhere down there, millions of humans and elves lived together unaware of her. The Krellian fleet commander Zethrak studied his tactical display with satisfaction that bordered on smugness. 3 human destroyers had been reduced to debris in the last hour, and the planetary defense grid was failing sector by sector. Earth would fall before the day cycle ended, and then the real prize could be claimed. Rare minerals and biological resources and a population that could be put to useful work in the Empire mines. His second officer approached with a tablet showing updated projections, and the news was good. Human resistance was collapsing faster than expected. Their weapons technology was adequate, but their tactics were primitive and their ships were designed for exploration, not war. The Krellian Empire had been conquering worlds for 1,000 years and knew how to break defenders who relied on hope. Rather than experience, Zethrak was about to order the final assault wave when his sensor officer made a sound that was not quite a word, more of a choke of confusion. The commander turned with irritation that died the moment he saw the main display. 30 contacts had appeared on sensors, large contacts moving at speeds that should not be possible. They had simply materialized from nowhere as if they had been invisible, and decided to stop being so. The ships were unlike anything in the Krellian database. They were sleek where Krellian warships were brutal. They gleamed silver and blue where Krellian ships were gunmetal gray. And they were reading power signatures that made the sensor officer check his instruments 3 times. Because surely they had to be malfunctioning. No ship could generate that much energy without ripping itself apart. Before Zethrak could demand answers, the communication system activated without being triggered. A hologram appeared in the center of the bridge showing an elf woman with 2 dragons flanking her. The commander had seen elves before. They ran cargo between systems and kept to themselves and were useful for trade negotiations. This elf did not look like a merchant. She looked like someone who had come to deliver a message written in fire. Lisa Morgan spoke and her voice carried through every Krellian ship simultaneously. She told them that they had made a mistake, and that they were going to leave Earth immediately and completely. Zethrak started to laugh, but the sound died in his throat when the elf continued speaking. She told him that the ships surrounding his fleet carried weapons that could atomize his entire force in under 10 minutes. She told him that the dragons heading toward his position could tear through ship hulls like they were tissue paper. She told him that the elves had spent 2 centuries preparing for exactly this moment. Zethrak cut the transmission and barked orders to his weapons officers. This was a bluff. It had to be. Elves did not have warships. Elves did not make threats. Elves certainly did not have dragons that could survive in vacuum. He ordered his fleet to open fire on the nearest elf ship, and 30 Krellian warships unleashed enough firepower to level a continent. The elf ship did not explode. It did not even slow down. Shields that glowed like blue starlight absorbed every shot, and the ship continued its approach without bothering to return fire. Zethrak felt something he had not experienced in decades of military service. Uncertainty. It crept up his spine like ice, water. Then the elf ships fired back and the universe turned into light and noise and terror. Weapons that seemed to tear holes in space itself reached out and touched 3 Krellian destroyers. The ships did not explode in the traditional sense. They simply stopped existing. One moment they were there and the next there was empty space and expanding clouds of particles that had once been metal, and crew and dreams of conquest. The dragons arrived next, and Zethrak understood that some myths were based in truth. Ember came first like a comet made of scales and fury. He slammed into the side of a Krellian cruiser and his claws cut through armor that was rated to withstand asteroid impacts. Nova followed, and her breath was not fire but something worse. Concentrated energy that melted metal and set off chain reactions in power cores. Behind them, 10 more dragons appeared, and each one carried an elf rider who guided them with perfect precision. They moved through the battle space like they had been born to it, and perhaps they had been. Ancient instincts waking up after millennia of sleep. The Krellian ships tried to target them, but the dragons were too fast and too small and wrapped in magic that made targeting systems scream errors. Zethrak watched his fleet die ship by ship and knew he had lost before the battle truly began. He opened channels to his captains and ordered a full retreat, but half of them did not respond because they were already gone. The elf ships were not pursuing destroyed vessels. They were being surgical and precise, destroying weapons but leaving life support intact when possible, disabling engines but not vaporizing entire crews. It was mercy of a sort, and somehow that made it worse. On Earth, Kate Sullivan stood in the Defense Coordination Center watching her displays with an expression that cycled between relief and shock and complete confusion. The Krellian fleet was running and dying in equal measure, and doing it because ships she had never seen before were dismantling them with almost casual efficiency. She pulled up identification codes on the mystery fleet and felt her stomach drop when the results came back. Elf ships, registered to the Elf Council with registration dates going back decades. Earth had allies with a secret military that apparently rivaled anything the Krellians could field. Kate did not know whether to be grateful or angry or terrified. Probably all 3. She opened a channel to the lead elf ship and waited while the connection established. When Lisa Morgan appeared on screen, Kate recognized her immediately. They had been friends since childhood. They had gone to school together and shared meals and secrets and late-night conversations about the future. Kate asked the obvious question, in a voice that was remarkably calm given the circumstances. She asked how long the elves had been hiding warships and dragons that could fight in space. Lisa looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. She apologized and said it was complicated, and that she wanted to explain everything, but first they needed to finish dealing with the Krellians. Kate wanted to argue, but she was a military officer and understood priorities. The explanation could wait. Surviving was more important. The battle over Earth ended in less than an hour from the moment the elf fleet arrived. 15 Krellian ships were destroyed completely. 10 were disabled and drifting with minimal life support. 5 managed to escape into faster-than-light travel, and were being tracked by elf scouts. Not a single human ship was lost after the elves arrived, though 3 were damaged badly enough to need extensive repairs. Zethrak survived, but only because his flagship was fast enough to jump away before the elf weapons found their mark. He sat in his command chair staring at nothing while his crew worked frantically to repair jump drives damaged by near misses. The reports coming in from across the Empire were not making things better. Elf ships had appeared at every major Krellian military installation simultaneously. Shipyards were burning. Weapons factories were rubble. Defense satellites were scrap metal. The attack was coordinated across hundreds of light years with precision that spoke of planning and patience. Back on Earth, Lisa landed the Silver Dawn at the Montana Sanctuary and walked out with Ember and Nova to find a crowd waiting. Humans and elves both, and they were not sure how to react. Some were cheering because the battle was won. Some were silent because they were processing the revelation that their elf neighbors had been hiding weapons of war. Some were crying because people they loved were alive when hours ago death had seemed certain. Kate was there in the front of the crowd, and she walked up to Lisa without hesitation. The two women stared at each other for a long moment, and then Kate did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She hugged Lisa hard enough that the elf let out a small sound of surprise. When Kate pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. She thanked Lisa for saving Earth and said they would talk about the secrets later, but right now she just wanted to be grateful that her friend had come through. Lisa felt something tight in her chest loosen and realized she had been terrified of this moment. She had been afraid that humans would see the weapons and the deception and decide the elves were no different from any other species that hoarded power. But Kate was looking at her like she always had, with trust and affection and understanding. Maybe humanity was different after all. The Elf Council requested an emergency meeting with Earth governments and the Galactic Council. Lisa was chosen to represent her people because she was bonded to dragons, and because she had human friends who could vouch for her character. The meeting was scheduled for 2 days later, at the neutral station orbiting Mars. Every major species would be represented, and the elves would have to explain themselves and their hidden fleet and their dragons. Lisa spent those 2 days preparing her speech and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. The galaxy ran on power and fear, and most species would see the elf fleet as a threat to the existing order. The Krellians would demand retaliation. The other empires would demand the elves disarm. Earth would be caught in the middle trying to defend allies who had lied by omission for centuries. Lisa spoke for 20 minutes without interruption and laid bare the history her people had tried to keep hidden. She told them about arriving at Earth as refugees with nothing but hope and desperation. She told them about humanity offering sanctuary when every other species had turned them away. She told them about the decision made 3 generations ago to never be helpless again and never watch their people suffer while begging for mercy from those who had none to give. She explained the hidden fleet and how it was built in secret over 2 centuries. She described the dragon eggs found by human miners and the ancient magic used to wake them. She detailed the weapons and the bases and the training that had gone into creating a force capable of defending against any threat, and she told them why it had all been kept secret, not because the elves wanted to conquer, but because they feared becoming like the species that had hurt them. They feared that showing power would invite challenges and wars and the very violence they were trying to prevent. The Krellian ambassador stood before she finished, and his voice was like acid when he spoke. He accused the elves of deception and treachery. He claimed the attack on Krellian military installations was unprovoked aggression. He demanded that the elf fleet be dismantled and the dragons destroyed, and the elf leadership tried for war crimes. His words echoed in the chamber, and several other species murmured agreement. Lisa let him finish and then asked a simple question. She asked how many worlds the Krellian Empire had invaded in the last century. The ambassador went silent and his skin color shifted to a darker shade that indicated discomfort. Lisa continued and pulled up data on the public screens. 43 worlds conquered, 62 billion sentient beings killed or enslaved, hundreds of species reduced to endangered status or extinction. The Krellian Empire had built itself on blood and suffering, and now they wanted to claim victim status because someone had finally hit back. The Vathari ambassador spoke next, and her tone was more measured but still critical. She acknowledged that Krellians were aggressive, but pointed out that the elf response was disproportionate. Destroying military installations across an entire empire was an act of total war. What was to stop the elves from doing the same to any species they disagreed with? How could the galaxy trust people who had lied about their capabilities for so long? Helen Carter stood from the human delegation and requested permission to speak. As the host species representative, she was granted it immediately. Helen looked around the chamber and let the silence stretch before she began. She thanked the council for their concerns and said she understood the fear that came with sudden revelations of hidden power. Then she asked them all to remember who the elves were and what they had done in 3 centuries of living among humans. Helen reminded them that elf traders were known throughout the galaxy for honest dealing and fair prices. She pointed out that elf scholars had shared discoveries freely with any species who asked. She noted that in 300 years there had not been a single incident of elf violence against humans or any other species until the Krellians attacked Earth. The elves had lived peacefully and productively, and the only reason they had weapons at all was because history had taught them that peace was not always an option. A smaller species representative from the Delphine cluster asked the question that many were thinking. She asked what would stop the elves and humans from combining their forces and becoming the next empire. Earth had numbers and resources and innovation. The elves had magic and dragons and weapons that could crack planets. Together they could dominate the galaxy if they chose. How could anyone trust that they would not? Kate stood this time, and her voice carried the weight of military authority. She said that humans and elves had been living together for 300 years, and in all that time neither species had shown imperial ambitions. Earth had opportunities to conquer weaker neighbors and chose trade instead. The elves had opportunities to use their hidden power and chose patience instead. The attack on Krellian installations was not conquest. It was protection. There was a difference, and everyone in this chamber should be smart enough to see it. Lisa added that the elves were proposing something the galaxy had never tried before. An alliance based not on power or profit, but on mutual respect and protection. Any species that wanted to join would be welcomed. Any species that chose neutrality would be left alone. Any species that chose aggression would face consequences. The rules were simple and applied to everyone equally, including humans and elves. No exceptions and no special treatment. The Krellian ambassador laughed, and the sound was ugly. He said the galaxy ran on power and always had. This talk of respect and cooperation was naive fantasy. Species took what they could and defended what they had, and that was the natural order. The elves had just proven they understood this by building weapons in secret. They were no different from anyone else, no matter what pretty words they used. Ember moved then, and the temperature in the chamber spiked 20 degrees in 3 seconds. The dragon stepped forward until his massive head was level with the Krellian ambassador, and smoke curled from his nostrils. The ambassador stumbled backward, and his guards reached for weapons but froze when Nova moved to flank them. The 2 dragons had not made a sound, but the threat was clear. Touch those weapons and find out what dragonfire felt like. Lisa called her dragons back, and they obeyed but slowly. She apologized for their reaction and explained that dragons bonded deeply with their riders and felt emotions through the connection. Amber had felt her anger at being called a liar and a hypocrite. Nova had felt her frustration at species who could not imagine cooperation without conquest. The dragons were protective, and sometimes that protection was aggressive. They were still learning restraint. The moment of tension broke, and several ambassadors actually looked amused. The Delphine representative asked if all the dragons were that reactive, and Lisa admitted that young dragons could be impulsive, but the 12 bonded to elves were well-trained and disciplined. Mostly. They had personalities. and opinions, and sometimes those came through louder than intended. It was part of bonding with creatures that were intelligent and independent. An unexpected voice spoke up from the back of the chamber. The Centaurian elder, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally stood, and his words carried weight because Centaurians were known for logic and careful analysis. He said that he had reviewed the data from the battle over Earth and the attacks on Krellian installations. The elf response was remarkably restrained given the provocation. They had targeted military assets and avoided civilian casualties. They had disabled ships rather than destroying them when possible. They had offered the Krellian fleet multiple chances to retreat before using lethal force. The elder continued and said that his species had studied human behavior since they joined the galactic community. Humans were unusual in their tendency toward cooperation and their willingness to help others even at cost to themselves. The Centaurians had wondered if this was sustainable, or if humans would eventually become like every other species. 300 years of observation suggested that humanity might actually be different, and if the elves had learned cooperation from humans, then perhaps this alliance they proposed was worth considering. Other species began talking among themselves, and the council chamber filled with dozens of conversations in multiple languages. Lisa stood at the speaker platform with her dragons and waited. She could feel the momentum shifting, but did not know which direction it would settle. Some species would join the alliance because they saw opportunity. Some would refuse because they feared change. Some would wait and watch and decide later. All she could do was trust that the truth would be enough. After an hour of debate, the council reconvened and a vote was called. Not on whether to punish the elves for their hidden fleet, but on whether to recognize the proposed alliance as legitimate. 7 species voted yes immediately, including the Centaurians and the Delphine cluster. 4 species voted no, including the Krellians and the Vathari. The remaining species abstained pending further information. It was not an overwhelming victory, but it was enough to establish the alliance as a recognized political entity. The Krellian ambassador stormed out with his delegation and made threats about retaliation and consequences. Nobody paid attention, because everyone knew the Krellian military was in no position to threaten anyone after losing half their fleet and most of their infrastructure. They would spend the next decade rebuilding and rethinking their approach to galactic politics. Maybe they would learn something. Probably they would not, but at least they would not be invading anyone for a while. After the council adjourned, Lisa found herself surrounded by ambassadors who wanted private meetings and trade negotiations and defense agreements. She politely deferred them all to the Elf Council and escaped to a quiet observation deck with Kate and Helen. The 3 women sat in silence for a long time, watching Mars rotate slowly beneath them. Finally, Kate spoke and asked the question that had been bothering her since the battle. 3 weeks after the council meeting, Kate found herself standing in the Montana sanctuary watching dragons soar overhead and trying to remember how to breathe normally. The sanctuary covered 200 square miles of mountain wilderness that had been specially prepared for dragon habitation. Thermal vents kept the temperature comfortable even in winter. Artificial caves provided shelter and nesting sites. A small lake stocked with fish gave the dragons hunting practice. It was beautiful and isolated and completely overwhelming. Lisa stood beside her, looking more relaxed than Kate had seen her in months. Being home with her dragons in their natural environment had stripped away the layers of stress and diplomatic tension. She pointed out each dragon as they flew past and gave brief descriptions of their personalities. Ember was bold and protective. Nova was curious and playful. Ash was contemplative and preferred solitude. Blaze was competitive and always trying to prove himself. The descriptions went on, and each dragon sounded as individual as any person Kate had ever met. The 3 unbonded young dragons were kept in a separate area until they chose riders. Lisa explained that the bonding process was delicate and somewhat mysterious. The ancient elf texts described it as a meeting of souls where dragon and rider recognized something compatible in each other. It could not be forced or rushed. Some elves waited years before a dragon chose them. Some were never chosen at all, and that was not a reflection of worth, but simply a matter of compatibility. Kate felt nervous energy building in her stomach as they approached the young dragon area. She had faced Krellian warships without flinching, but the idea of being rejected by a dragon made her feel vulnerable in a way combat never did. Lisa sensed her anxiety through long friendship and squeezed her shoulder. She reminded Kate that this was not a test, and there was no failure. If the dragons did not bond, then Kate could still learn about them and ride as a passenger, and be part of the partnership between humans and dragons. The outcome did not change her value or importance. The three young dragons were smaller than the adults but still massive by human standards. Each was about the size of a large horse with wings that seemed too big for their bodies. They were practicing flight in an enclosed area, under the supervision of two adult dragons who were teaching them aerial maneuvers. When Lisa and Kate entered the area, all three youngsters stopped and turned to look at them with eyes that held intelligence and curiosity. Lisa introduced Kate using words and also something else, a kind of mental projection that Kate could almost feel brushing against her awareness. The dragons responded with chirps and rumbles, and one of them bounded over like an excited puppy. This one had scales that shifted between copper and gold depending on the light and eyes like molten amber. Lisa said his name was Dawn, and he was the youngest and most enthusiastic of the three. He was also the most impulsive, which meant he needed a rider who could provide balance and guidance. Dawn circled Kate while making interested noises and sniffing at her with obvious curiosity. Kate held still and tried not to think about the fact that this creature could bite her in half without effort. Dawn completed his circle and then did something unexpected. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead against Kate's chest right over her heart. The contact sent a jolt through Kate that was not quite physical and not quite mental, but something in between. She gasped and stumbled backward, and Dawn made a concerned sound. Lisa looked shocked in a way that Kate had rarely seen. She explained that what Dawn had just done was the first step of bonding. He was testing compatibility and seeing if their energies matched. The fact that Kate felt the contact so strongly suggested they might be compatible. But the actual bond would not form unless Kate consciously accepted it, and that decision should not be made lightly. Bonding with a dragon was permanent and deep. They would share emotions and sometimes thoughts. They would be responsible for each other in ways that went beyond normal friendship or partnership. Kate looked at Dawn, who was watching her with hope and eagerness and something that might have been pleading. She thought about her life and her work coordinating Earth defenses and the constant stress of preparing for threats that might never come. She thought about how isolated she sometimes felt, even surrounded by colleagues and friends. She thought about the moment during the battle, when she had watched elf ships arrive and felt saved by allies she did not know she had. Then she thought about what it might feel like to have a bond that went soul deep with a creature who would never lie, or manipulate or leave. She reached out and placed her hand on Dawn's head and said yes. The bond snapped into place like a circuit completing, and Kate felt Dawn's presence settle into a part of her mind she had not known was empty. His emotions flooded through her, joy and excitement and relief and affection so pure it made her eyes water. She could feel his youth and his eagerness to prove himself, and his absolute certainty that she was exactly who he had been waiting for. In return, he felt her determination, and her fierce protectiveness of those she loved, and her deep well of loyalty that had never found its perfect outlet until now. Lisa was grinning wide enough that her face had to hurt, and she congratulated both Kate and Dawn. She said this was unprecedented and important, and also perfectly right. The first human dragon rider. The first bond between species that had no historical precedent. The beginning of something new that could change the entire dynamic between humans and elves and dragons. Kate barely heard her, because she was overwhelmed by Dawn's presence in her mind and trying to figure out how to think clearly, with someone else's emotions mixing with her own. The next weeks were intense as Kate learned what it meant to be bonded to a dragon. Dawn was young, which meant he had energy that never seemed to run out. He wanted to fly constantly and hunt and play and explore. Kate had to balance that with her duties at the defense center, which meant early mornings and late nights and very little sleep. But she found she did not mind because Dawn's joy was infectious and his presence in her mind soothed anxiety she had carried for years. Learning to ride was harder than Kate expected. Dragons did not use saddles or bridles. Riders held on with their legs and controlled direction through the bond by projecting intentions and desires. It required a level of mental discipline Kate had not developed in her military training. She fell off Dawn 17 times in the first week before she figured out how to maintain the connection while also dealing with the physical reality of moving at high speed through three-dimensional space. Lisa trained her with patience that Kate appreciated more than she could express. The elf had been bonded to Ember and Nova for decades and made it look effortless. She taught Kate breathing techniques to maintain calm during flight. She showed her how to project clear intentions without overwhelming Dawn with too much information. She demonstrated combat maneuvers and explained the tactical advantages dragons provided in space and atmospheric battles. Kate absorbed everything and practiced until her muscles ached and her mind felt stretched thin. Other humans started showing interest once word spread about Kate's successful bonding. Military personnel wanted to know if dragons could be integrated into defense strategies. Scientists wanted to study the bond and understand its mechanisms. Politicians wanted to know if this changed the alliance structure between humans and elves. Kate found herself giving interviews and demonstrations and fielding questions she barely knew how to answer. Dawn handled the attention better than she did. He loved showing off and was always ready to perform aerial stunts for audiences. The Elf Council approached Kate with a proposal after 2 months of training. They wanted to invite other humans to the sanctuary and see if any of the remaining unbonded dragons would choose human riders. There were 5 young dragons total, who had not yet bonded, and 12 dragon eggs that would hatch in the next year. If humans could bond with dragons, then it made sense to explore that possibility rather than limiting bonds only to elves. Kate supported the idea immediately and volunteered to help screen candidates. They started with military volunteers who had the physical conditioning and mental discipline required for dragon riding. 300 applications came in within a week. Kate and Lisa worked together to narrow it down to 20 candidates who would visit the sanctuary for compatibility testing. The process was careful and slow because forcing bonds would be disastrous for everyone involved. Dragons chose riders based on criteria nobody fully understood, and rushing that process would help nobody. The testing process revealed interesting patterns. Physical strength mattered less than mental compatibility. Dragons responded to personality traits more than skills or experience. A young engineer with anxiety issues bonded with a dragon who was calm and steady. A medic with endless patience bonded with a dragon who was energetic but needed guidance. A pilot with reckless tendencies bonded with a dragon who was cautious and analytical. The bond seemed to form where dragon and human could balance each other and grow together. 5 years after the Battle of Earth, the galaxy looked fundamentally different. The alliance that had started with 7 species had grown to 23 with more considering membership. Trade routes that had been controlled by Empire fleets were now patrolled by alliance ships, ensuring safe passage for all. Pirates and raiders found themselves facing dragons and weapons they could not counter. Species that had lived under threat of conquest for generations were learning to breathe freely. Lisa sat in her office aboard the Silver Dawn reviewing reports from across Alliance territory and feeling the weight of responsibility that came with success. She was now the official liaison between the Elf Council and the Alliance Military Command. She coordinated dragon rider training programs across multiple species who had proven compatible. She managed diplomatic relations with neutral species. She dealt with logistics and politics in endless meetings that made her miss the simple days of flying with Ember and Nova. The Alliance had proven more successful than anyone predicted, and that success brought complications. Some species wanted to expand aggressively and bring in new members whether they were ready or not. Others wanted strict requirements and lengthy probation periods. Economic interest clashed with security concerns. Old prejudices surfaced even among species trying to cooperate. Building something new meant constantly fighting the temptation to slip back into old patterns. The Krellian Empire was one of the biggest challenges. After their defeat, they had fractured into multiple factions. Some wanted revenge and were building up military forces in secret. Others wanted reform and were trying to join the alliance. Most were just trying to survive the economic collapse that came from losing their conquest-based economy. The Alliance Council debated constantly about how to handle the situation. Some advocated leaving the Krellians to sort themselves out. Others pushed for intervention and humanitarian aid. Lisa believed in helping, but she also remembered what the Krellians had done and what they would have done if the elves had not stopped them. Earth would have been enslaved. Billions of humans would have died or been worked to death in Krellian mines. Trust was complicated when history was written in blood. But holding grudges forever meant staying locked in cycles of violence that benefited nobody. She advocated for conditional aid, help for Krellian civilians, but consequences for any faction that tried to rebuild their military for aggression. Kate had been promoted to admiral, in charge of the Alliance defense, coordination, and she spent most of her time managing the integration of different species' military doctrines. Humans fought with precision and overwhelming firepower. Elves fought with magic and misdirection. The Centaurians used logic-based strategies that sometimes confused allies as much as enemies. The Delphine cluster species preferred defensive positions and attrition. Making all these approaches work together required patience and creativity, and Kate had developed both in abundance. Dawn had grown into a massive dragon who was now larger than Ember, and almost as large as the oldest dragons in the sanctuary. His copper-gold scales had darkened with age, and his eyes held wisdom that seemed beyond his years. Kate sometimes forgot that Dawn was still young by dragon standards, because he carried himself with such confidence and authority. The bond between them had deepened until she could barely remember what it felt like to be alone in her own head. The Dragon Rider program had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. 43 humans had bonded with dragons, 12 elves had bonded with newly hatched dragons, and surprisingly 5 Centaurians had proven compatible and bonded successfully. The Centaurians approached dragon riding with their characteristic logic and created training manuals that were now used across all species. They analyzed flight patterns and combat tactics and bond mechanics with scientific rigor that complemented the intuitive approach elves had always used. Lisa received a message one morning that made her stomach clench with anxiety. The Vathari Empire was requesting a meeting to discuss potential alliance membership. The Vathari had been openly hostile during the original council sessions and had allied themselves with Krellian interests. They had spent 5 years watching the alliance grow and their own influence shrink. Now they were reconsidering their position, but Lisa did not trust their motivations. She consulted with Kate and Helen and the Elf Council before responding. They agreed to meet, but insisted on neutral territory and transparency. No secret negotiations and no backdoor deals. If the Vathari wanted to join, they would have to do it openly and accept the same terms as everyone else. Lisa drafted a response that was polite but firm and sent it off, knowing that this meeting could either strengthen the alliance significantly or reveal divisions that enemies could exploit. The meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks later at the Mars station, where the original alliance had been proposed. Lisa spent those weeks preparing and trying not to assume the worst. Ember sensed her stress through the bond and became more protective than usual. He insisted on accompanying her everywhere and watched other species with suspicion that bordered on paranoia. Nova tried to lighten the mood by playing pranks that ranged from hiding Lisa's data pads to stealing food from the mess hall. The dragon's balance of serious protection and playful mischief helped keep Lisa centered. When the Vathari delegation arrived, they came with impressive ceremony. Their ambassador was a woman named Valera, who had a reputation for shrewd negotiation and absolute loyalty to Vathari interests. She brought a security detail and advisors and enough recording equipment to document every word spoken. Lisa met her in the main conference room with Kate and Helen and representatives from 6 other Alliance species. They wanted the Vathari to understand that decisions were made, collectively, not by a single power. Valera spoke for an hour about how the Vathari Empire had reassessed galactic dynamics and concluded that cooperation offered more benefits than competition. She detailed economic analyses and security projections and demographic trends that all pointed toward alliance membership being in Vathari interests. Her presentation was professional and thorough, and completely failed to address the real question. Did the Vathari actually believe in the alliance principles, or were they just looking for advantages? Lisa asked that question directly, and the room went silent. Valera looked surprised that someone would be so blunt in diplomatic discussions, but recovered quickly. She admitted that Vathari leadership was divided. Some genuinely wanted reform and believed cooperation was better for their people. Others saw alliance membership as a strategic move to gain access to dragon riders and elf technology. She could not promise that all Vathari would embrace alliance values, but she could promise that the reform faction was gaining power and willing to prove their commitment. Kate asked what proof they could offer, and Valera produced documentation that stunned everyone in the room. The Vothari had arrested and charged 17 officials who had been planning military strikes against Alliance members. They had dismantled secret weapons programs that violated treaties. They had opened their financial records to show where resources were being allocated. They had done all this before even requesting the meeting as a show of good faith. It was unprecedented and suspicious, and also exactly the kind of transparency the Alliance required. The discussion went on for 6 hours with breaks for delegations to consult internally. The Alliance representatives asked hard questions about Vothari history and current practices. Valera answered with honesty that sometimes made her own people uncomfortable. She did not try to hide the ugly parts of Vothari culture or pretend that change would be easy. She acknowledged that trust would take time, and offered to accept probationary membership with limited voting rights until they proved themselves. Lisa found herself respecting Valera, even while remaining cautious. The Vothari ambassador was clearly intelligent and dedicated to her people, but she also seemed tired of the old ways. She spoke about a younger generation of Vothari who wanted something different, who were tired of militarism and empire building and wanted to explore cooperation, who looked at human and elf partnerships and wondered why their species could not have something similar. The Alliance representatives voted after consulting with their home governments. The decision was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The Vothari would be accepted as probationary members for 5 years. They would have access to trade benefits and mutual defense, but limited input on policy decisions. They would be monitored closely, and any violations of Alliance principles would result in immediate expulsion. Valera accepted the terms without negotiation and thanked the Council for the opportunity. After the meeting, Lisa found herself on an observation deck with Kate and Dawn watching ships come and go from the station. They talked about whether they had made the right choice and whether the Vothari would prove trustworthy. Kate said time would tell and there was no way to know except by trying. Dawn projected agreement through the bond to Kate, and then extended a tendril of thought to Lisa through proximity. The dragon believed in second chances because he had watched species change. The Centaurians had been aggressive isolationists before joining the Alliance. Now they were among the strongest supporters of cooperation.